The question of what makes a good sequel has always been a widely discussed topic in the general gaming sphere. While it's easy enough to point out the hallmarks of a disappointing or poor sequel, which is helped by the sheer mass of examples you can point to,
your feelings for her are not real.
They are real to me!
if you were to ask someone what actually makes a sequel exceptional and a worthy successor to the original, there's a good chance you'd get a very different answer based on who you ask. Some people might say that a good sequel is a game that stays close to the original concept and core gameplay, while continuing the story and expanding on its mechanics, so that the fans of the original just get more of what they already love. But some detractors might reply that sequels that are too similar to the original game feel derivative and uninspired. Other people might say the opposite and claim that a good sequel is a game that sets itself apart from the original and does everything it can to be distinct. Thus, it won't spend its existence stuck in the original's shadow. But others might point out that if a game strays too far from the original ideas and concepts, it can stop even feeling like a sequel, no matter how perfect the game is otherwise. It's pretty easy to see from that example why this conversation can become very complicated. People often value different things more than others, and that leads to their perspective on something like the quality of a sequel naturally differing. Yet every once in a while, there is a sequel that almost everyone is able to come together and agree was an amazing successor to what came before it. And probably one of the first examples that would come to anyone's mind when asked about that type of sequel is The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. While initially the second N64 Zelda game was not quite as broadly worshipped as its predecessor Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask has been a critical darling of the Zelda fandom and the internet in general for years now. At this point, there are plenty of people who would rank it above Ocarina and even any other Zelda game in general. But why exactly is that? If you look at the game from a very surface level perspective, in some ways you'd notice what are usually features of a mediocre or bad sequel. The game was notoriously rushed through development in a single year, forcing them to port over most of the mechanics and gameplay from Ocarina with barely any changes. Most of the assets, including even character models, were blatantly taken from Ocarina, as are most of the items you'll collect. And with such a limited time, the main story of the game only includes 4 dungeons compared to the 9 dungeons present in Ocarina of Time. It's to the point where if the game had been released today, there would probably be people jokingly calling it glorified Ocarina of Time DLC. So why is this rushed game that was created out of reused content considered by most to be the best sequel to Ocarina of Time, when later games had far more time and money put into them? There's a number of reasons people commonly bring up, from the game's general uniqueness among Zelda and just games in general, to the game having beloved mechanics that we never saw again, to it being the dark and scary Zelda. I've never really found any of these answers satisfactory by themselves, however. From my perspective, Majora's Mask is as beloved as it is because it is essentially the gold standard for sequels. It perfectly manages to maintain and expand on things you love about Ocarina, while also setting itself apart from its titanic precursor in a way that no other Zelda game since has replicated. From its gameplay to its story, Majora's Mask is one of the best sequels I have ever experienced, and whether you already love the game or have never played it, I hope to show you in this video just how incredible it actually is. As I mentioned previously, the gameplay of Majora's Mask seems very similar to Ocarina, and in a lot of fundamental ways it is. The movement and combat are essentially identical to Ocarina with a few changes. The camera and Z targeting also function in the same way, which could be a good or bad thing depending on how you felt about the mechanic. While this decision likely was made to save time, one thing I will say in defense of it is that it creates a very strong connection between Ocarina and Majora within the base mechanics. If you've played Ocarina before, you should be able to jump into Majora's Mask without any issue, and that kind of familiarity can be helpful to ease a player into a sequel that may be different from its predecessor in other ways. It only truly becomes a problem if nothing is added to the gameplay to expand on what was already there, but luckily in Majora's case, they did exactly that. While Link plays identically to how he did in Ocarina of Time in his normal form, that is not the only version of Link you'll have the ability to control within this game. There are 3 different transformation masks that allow you to take on a completely different form, each of which completely transforms the gameplay, from their attacks to their movement to even things like weight. The Deku mask allows for skipping across water, shooting bubbles, flying through the air. The Goron mask lets you roll around like a certain blue animal. And the Zora mask allows you to travel through the water in a fast and agile way I have almost never seen replicated again in gaming. The transformation masks add an incredible amount of variety to the combat and mobility, and can turn even mundane things like traversing the map into a fun experience as you try to learn how to use them. And while in other games, using different forms as a gimmick can feel forced and irritating due to the game insisting that you use them to solve every problem you come across to the point of exhaustion, here the forms are implemented well enough into the environment of the game that when they are needed to solve problems, it feels perfectly natural, and often there are alternative methods you could use anyway. On the more traditional item side of things, the majority of them are indeed carryovers from Ocarina, but some of the additions like ice arrows are some of the most interesting items we've ever gotten in 3D Zelda, and the lack of item variety is more than made up for by the masks you'll be collecting throughout the game. Ignoring the previously mentioned transformation masks, there are 20 other masks you can collect via side objectives as you progress through the game. Some only have singular one-off uses, but others, like the stone mask or bunny hood, are some of the most useful items in Zelda history. The overworld is thankfully completely original, and it's one of the main places where I'd say this game outright has Ocarina of Time beat. Hyrule Field was technically impressive, but a problem it had was that it felt far too empty and somewhat dull. Termina Field is smaller, but because everything isn't as stretched out, the landmarks and pathways leading to different locations give it far more character, with specific enemies spawning in different areas. Clocktown serves as the game's central hub, and it feels far more lively and larger than Hyrule Castletown, which is helped by it being populated by far more characters who do more than just stand in one specific spot the whole game. The more specific areas that progress into the 4 dungeons also match Ocarina's in character often, and each manage to pull their own weight as a decently sized portion of the game. Although here I would say the game can sometimes falter and pad the areas out a little too much, with Great Bay and Ikana Valley in particular feeling like victims of this. The dungeons themselves also manage to be similar in quality to Ocarina, and even manage to set themselves apart when it comes to their general theming and structure. In particular, the Stone Tower is probably one of my favorite dungeons in all of Zelda, while on the other hand, the Great Bay Temple sometimes makes me want to shove glass in my eyes. But hey, I'm not gonna pretend like the Water Temple in Ocarina doesn't elicit similar emotions. Overall though, I'd say the areas are at worst serviceable and at best similar in quality to Ocarina. The bosses of the game also manage to have creative designs and aren't nearly as rigid in how you need to fight them as Ocarina's bosses were. Odalwa is relatively short and simple, but it's made up for by how many attacks the boss can use against you, encouraging the player to engage him in different ways based on what he's doing. Got is pretty unique as a boss, since for once you're going on the offensive and chasing after him. Gjorg is certainly a boss of all time. More seriously, I think the concept of being able to fight him both above and below the water is a decent idea. I just think this fight is held back by the camera tending to be rather cumbersome, not to mention transforming in and out of Zora form to dive into the water can be a little awkward. Twin Mold is similar to Odalwa in the sense that it's not very complex, but here I'd probably say that's a bad thing. The boss is basically just using the Giant's Mask and wailing on them as they fly around. Finally, Majora cycles through 3 different forms for you to fight in the endgame, and if you don't collect all the masks to become the Fierce Deity, these are all pretty fun to fight with some genuine challenge. If I were to compare the 2 games' bosses, I'd probably still say Ocarina has the better ones overall, but Ocarina also has far more bosses to pick from, so it's not exactly a fair comparison. Lastly, because this game was developed as a sequel to Ocarina, it doesn't feel the need to be quite as handholdy, which means there's a bit more room for the players to figure things out themselves, and it also means this disease can finally let me have peace. Although while I appreciate the owl not constantly pestering me for half the game, ironically I think the game sometimes suffers from the opposite issue now, where things can be a bit too vague and the things you need to do to progress can feel strange. Like needing to race the Gorman brothers to get a mask that is essential for getting inside Ikana Valley. The game still drops hints of course, so it's not completely leaving you in the dark, but it's worth mentioning. All of these are relatively small changes however compared to what is probably the most notorious part of the game, the 3-day cycle. Most Zelda games have a rather laid-back pace. You're allowed to travel and go about completing the main story and side content in whatever way you want. The games were pretty much designed with the idea of you taking your time to explore. Majora's Mask takes this concept and completely flips it on its head, giving the player 3 in-game days to work with before the moon that looms above Clocktown falls from the sky and destroys everything. Of course, Link is able to use the Song of Time to reverse everything back to the first day, but when you do that, it's not just the time that resets. Everything does. Aside from key items and a few other rare exceptions, when you reset time, everything resets with you, which means you can't just stop halfway through an objective, then go back and finish it after resetting time. You'd think that that would mean that the game would stop prioritizing player exploration and experimentation, but in reality it's the opposite. Majora's Mask is designed in a way that encourages the player to explore and try new things more than possibly any other 3D Zelda game before Breath of the Wild. From Clock Town to Romani Ranch to even the areas housing the dungeons, every area within the game is filled with specific events that only happen at certain times on certain days. NPCs often have specific schedules or patterns they will follow, and that in some cases you will need to learn to do a quest correctly. And if you want to do the side content or even some of the stuff connected to the main story, you'll need to engage with this system and learn what needs to be done through a certain amount of trial and error. If you show up at Romani Ranch on the third day, once the boulder blocking it has been broken as an example, you will have missed both quest opportunities here and won't be able to do much. You'll need to reset to the first day and find your own way to open the pathway if you want to get Epona back. There are countless other examples, of course, from the Anju and Cafe quest to the old woman being robbed on the first night, and even beyond that, there are smaller objectives also connected to the 3-day system, such as collecting all the stray fairies while inside a dungeon to get a reward, or upgrading your sword. While this might seem like it could get frustrating, and I'm sure for some people it is, I think this system was honestly ingenious. It took the standard gameplay loop of Zelda, the dungeons, the quests, the item collection, and remained faithful to it while completely reshaping it at the same time. You need to plan your 3 days out and try to do everything as efficiently as possible to make sure you get everything you might need. Then once you're finished, you can play the Song of Time to restart everything all over again. While Ocarina of Time feels like a grand quest with a large overarching goal for you to achieve, Majora sticks you in a loop that you are then forced to try and escape, with the reminder of what's at stake constantly hanging over your head. It's this cycle and all the other things I mentioned previously that contribute to why the game design of Majora's Mask is so highly praised, both as an individual game and a sequel. The game somehow manages to feel familiar and directly tied to Ocarina, while also feeling foreign and completely distinct from any Zelda game that had existed before. Later games would try to expand upon Ocarina's game design in their own way, but despite the better circumstances they were created under, they failed to capture the same perfect balance Majora found between old and new, between being faithful and being distinct. The story of Majora's Mask in some ways is both easier and harder to talk about when you're comparing it to Ocarina of Time. On the one hand, I don't think it really needs to be explained why this game's story is considered unique or weird compared to Ocarina, or any other Zelda game for that matter. There's hardly no mention of Zelda, and the Triforce and Ganon are both absent from the game entirely, which is usually something only allowed for far smaller scale projects like the Minish Cap, and even those games usually don't stray quite so far away from the story fundamentals of Zelda as Majora does. On the other hand, though, not only does that make it more difficult to draw a meaningful connection between it and Ocarina of Time, the story of Majora's Mask does not give a lot of straight answers about the lore it's introducing, or even something as simple as what Termina is. It's already difficult to talk about things like character growth and the thematic meaning of a story when the protagonist doesn't speak, but when so much of what's happening in the game is shrouded in a certain amount of mystery that the fandom still argues about, it becomes especially hard. So if there are parts in this segment where it seems like I'm delving into headcanon territory when discussing the game's story, I apologize. With that being said though, what is Majora's Mask about, and how does it connect to Ocarina of Time like I claimed? Well, the game luckily makes it clear that this is in fact a direct sequel within the opening, citing Link's adventure through time and then saying he embarked on a far more personal journey. The word personal may not jump out at a first reading, but I think it sheds some light on how I believe Majora's Mask continues Link's story from Ocarina of Time. I said in my video on Ocarina that it's an excellent modern depiction of the hero's journey. Our unsuspecting hero is called upon to go on a quest where he will meet new people, gain new experiences, and in the end be changed forever, only to finally return home once the journey is finished. Within that narrative structure though, it's rare for us to see what happens to the hero after the story ends. Once the book closes or the credits roll, what happens to them? Do they just go back to their ordinary life? Be happy? The answer depends on the story, but in the case of Ocarina of Time, the answer is a resounding no. Link may have defeated Ganondorf and saved Hyrule, but to do so he had to sacrifice everything that he cared about. He lost his surrogate father, was forced to sacrifice his childhood and sleep for 7 years while Ganondorf ravaged the kingdom, was forced to watch as his friends became sages, meaning they can never live in the same world as him again, and at the end of it all, he's sent back to a world where no one remembers his sacrifice, and the last connection he has to his journey The person that was his constant companion and only way of returning home to the forest leaves him. Link returns to the world he left at the start of his journey, but he is not the same Link he once was. He's now a child with the memories and experiences of an adult who was forced to make choices and sacrifices that no child should ever make. He has no home to return to, and there is no one left who can understand what he's been through. Even before anything was done to him by Skull Kid, Link had already been met with a terrible fate. But that leads into what I believe Majora's Mask is about. If Ocarina is about the hero's journey, how our young protagonist fulfills his destiny and saves the world, Majora's Mask is about the hero picking up the pieces. It's a story about what happens after the journey. It's a story about mourning and also healing. If you've watched any amount of theory-related videos about Majora's Mask or Zelda, you're probably already familiar with the long-standing idea that the different areas you explore through the game represent a different part of the 5 stages of grief. The people of Clocktown are, for the most part, in complete denial about their impending death, insisting that the moon won't fall until the last day when they finally begin to wake up. The Deku King has become enraged at the disappearance of his daughter and has begun lashing out at an innocent monkey despite having no proof of his guilt. The ghost of the Goron Darmani in the Goron village tries to bargain with Link to bring him back to life, and if he can't do that, asks that Link at least ease his sorrows. Lulu, the lead singer of Great Bay's band, has become depressed and despondent to the point of being unable to speak after her eggs were stolen from her. And lastly, in Ikana Valley, Link not only helps the spirits there come to terms with the fact their time has ended, but also seems to reach his own state of acceptance. But we'll come back to that last part later. This seemingly at least partially intentional decision made within the story has spawned many different theories, the most common theory probably being the Link is dead theory suggested by MatPat. I find that particular theory, however, to be missing the point of what this seems truly connected to. You don't go through the 5 stages of grief over your own death. You grieve over the loss of something else, be it someone you loved or something you once had. There are numerous different things you could attribute the grief to in Link's case. The loss of his childhood, the loss of his friends within Ocarina of Time, but I think the one I believe in the most is the loss the game itself calls attention to. The person Link is looking for at the start of the game. Navi. Navi was possibly Link's closest friend of all. She was the last connection he had to his home in the Kokiri Forest. She was the last friend he had left, who stood by him through all his suffering, and when she left, Link was finally, truly alone. Whether she's dead or merely had to leave Link for whatever reason, he is mourning her and is desperate to get her back. Desperate enough that he'd leave Hyrule to go searching for her with no idea where she went or how to find her. And that's exactly how Link ends up in Termina. The people of Termina reflect Link's own internal pain and emotional state. His refusal to accept that she's gone, his anger, his attempt at bargaining to find her, and eventually his depression. And there is no character that showcases that better than the main antagonist. While Skull Kid is introduced to the player as an annoying brat toying with power he doesn't understand, one who doesn't even care if countless people die because of his games, it becomes increasingly clear what he actually is yet another hurt child. A child who feels as though his friends have abandoned him. A child who feels completely alone and who is lashing out at everyone around him, even his friends. The mask may be exasperating his worst qualities, but his behavior and past is almost a perfect parallel to Link. After everything Link has been through, he'd have every excuse to be bitter. He sacrificed everything precious to himself and was given almost nothing in return. He is alone and isolated with no direction or purpose. It'd be easy for him to become like Skull Kid, yet Link doesn't become like Skull Kid. The journey of Majora's Mask is described as personal at the very start, and that has more meaning than just one. Link's journey to save Hyrule was one of destiny. It was his fate to do so, even if he did have personal stake in it, but his quest to save Termina is not so simple. Link has no destiny involving Termina. He doesn't even belong here, and while you could argue he needs to stop the moon to save himself, his actions throughout the game do not support that even being close to his main goal. Throughout his period in Termina, time and time again, we see Link come to the aid of everyone around him. We see him protect and help the living while easing the regrets of broken and hurt souls to help them move on. The game encourages you to help everyone, big problems or small. Link has no reason to care this much, yet he continues to. All of the pain he's went through, all of the suffering, it changed Link in a lot of ways, but it could never destroy Link's most fundamental trait, his kindness. His own personal trauma only made Link more determined to help those around him not feel the same pain he feels, and so he takes it upon himself to heal the people of Termina. From a father concerned for his daughter, a spirit desperate to save his people, a mother who lost her newborns, a little girl concerned for the safety of farm animals and her older sister trying to fill her deceased father's shoes, a loving couple torn apart by circumstance, or a fairy who wishes to be reunited with her little brother. In the end, even Skull Kid was just another person who needed his help. Link selflessly helps all of these people, and through that kindness, Link is able to see the effect he truly had on the world. It may be easy for him to think no one appreciated his actions, but they do, and they always have. Link's heroics were always treasured, and the people of Termina show it. And with that kindness and happiness that they give back to Link, Link is able to begin healing himself. Once the journey has ended and Termina is saved, he is able to finally move past his own pain and head in a brighter direction, towards a life where he can find peace despite what's happened to him. Or at least that's what I'd say if we're looking at the game in a vacuum and don't think about the fact that Link comes back later as a grumpy zombie man who, according to Hyrule Historia, never got over the fact people forgot about him. But in the game itself, it's never explicitly stated to be this Link, or that he's upset people don't remember him, just that he never passed his skills on to anyone and that's why he couldn't pass on. So for once, I'm just going to ignore supplementary material. Go away, Hyrule Historia. I don't care about your opinion. Overall, though, I believe this is the best continuation of Link's story that we honestly could have gotten. Just as it was inspiring to watch Link come into his own and become the hero his homeland needed in Ocarina of Time, it's heartwarming to see our hero continue to have courage in face of his own personal issues and overcome them, all while continuing to heal and assist those who need his help. In the end, it shows that it was never the Triforce or the Master Sword that made Link a hero. Link is a hero because of who he is. It's what allows him to persevere no matter how hard things get. His good deeds may not be able to undo what's happened to him. He can't bring his friends back or relive his childhood. No one can do that. But through showing kindness to others and helping them find happiness, Link can likewise find happiness through them as well. That hole in his heart can become healed, so long as he allows it to be. It's a rare occasion within the gaming world for me when I go back to play a good game I enjoy, and then I feel an almost immediate need to go and play the sequel as well. There are plenty of amazing sequels that still don't quite manage to elicit that same feeling within me, but Majora's Mask always manages to. Whenever I go back to play Ocarina of Time, there's a good chance I'll be playing through Majora's Mask again as well within the next few months. Honestly, that's probably why when I'm asked which I think is better, it's a rather difficult question for me. If you really wanted to force an answer out of me, I guess I'd say I might slightly prefer Ocarina, but really I've always viewed these two games as a twin pair. You can't fully appreciate how amazing Majora's Mask is without first playing Ocarina of Time, but likewise, the experience of Ocarina is improved by knowing Majora is what comes after. At least that's how I've always felt about it. That might not sound that impressive, but really it's hard to describe just how unique that is for a game sequel, and it's achieved by a game that was rushed together in a panic within a single year. If you think about it from a certain perspective though, that might be why Majora was so successful in the first place. It's honestly probably the best example you could ever give of lightning in a bottle, where it's the underlying circumstance of its creation that allowed the game to become so special. If it wasn't for the rush development, we almost certainly wouldn't have all these things that contribute to the game's greatness, and that shows with the sequels they developed later. The later 3D Zelda sequels are of course excellent games in their own right, and you can tell when you play many of them that the developers were intensely devoted to creating a worthy sequel to Ocarina of Time. Yet despite having more time and a higher budget, they don't achieve the same standard Majora already set. Wind Waker and Twilight Princess both at times feel like the type of sequels I mentioned at the start, unable to escape Ocarina's shadow. Meanwhile, Skyward Sword attempts to set itself apart with arguably an even grander narrative, yet in some ways fails to understand what made Ocarina work so well mechanically. Breath of the Wild avoided all of these issues, but to do so Nintendo needed to also abandon the framework Ocarina set and go back to the style of the even older games. In a way, it was almost their way of conceding defeat, accepting that they were never going to replicate that same quality of Ocarina again. Yet in my opinion, they already did replicate that quality, at least for the most part. It may be rough around the edges in some ways, or in some ways not feel like a Zelda story, but I think Majora stands along Ocarina as an equally amazing experience. I'd say it's almost fitting in a way. that the only thing that could match Nintendo's long-labored and expertly crafted game to bring Zelda into the 3D era was a weird rush job brimming with creativity. If you wanted some sort of lesson to take away at the end of the video, if you're working on a project, provided it's something art-related at least, you can spend as much time as you want trying to plan everything out, focusing on every tiny detail, but there are times where you may just need to take the leap and start working on it. Even something you might view as a mistake could end up just making it more interesting when it's finished. Although, as a disclaimer, I am not saying you should do what Nintendo did and try to develop a whole game within a single year. Please try to remember that for every single game like Majora's Mask that managed to turn that rushed production into a strength, there's a game like Sonic 06. So, please, don't make another Sonic 06.
What is this? Get off! What is this?
Alright, I think that's it. Take it easy, everyone.